Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. This is a question from listener Bob Mottram. I'm not going to do it any justice in this recording. Kind of a long week. It's going to be a long weekend. And this Short Funk recording is just one of the small, pleasant things that I could put out through this extended experience. But I wanted to talk a little bit associated with the revisionist history of the Vietnam War. Now, I use the term revisionist here. It may not be quite the right term. Revisionist is a term that's used in Marxist theory, but it also means to revise an existing history. So I think you can revise an existing history without having a Marxist purpose, which is why I use the term revisionist history. Just a little piece of eccentricity associated with my own mind and the use of language, in any case. It's probably best that I just start out explaining what I see the revisionist history as being. The revisionist history, put simply, is that the US actually won the conflict in Vietnam. And what happened was, through the early 70s leading up to 1975, the US basically withdrew military support to the point where the US left in 1975 with their head held high. And what happened following was all the responsibility of the South Vietnamese. So it wasn't in fact that the war in Vietnam was a military blunder by the US. It was that the South Vietnamese couldn't hold their own against the North Vietnamese that were coming down. And basically the US has no moral responsibility associated with this. And quite frankly, the US always wins military conflicts that they engage with. I first heard this in the US in 2005. I don't even know what one would call her. Occasional Richard Dawkins sparring partner, political commentator, maybe, Ann Coulter. And Ann Coulter had a narrative that the US had actually won the war in Vietnam. And at the time, it was seriously and critically lampooned. But then, somewhere through this period of time, I started to realize that actually there was a movement to change the history of the war in Vietnam associated with an American victory. And I've also seen aspects of this through my connection with Model Rail Radio. I have military folk who are based in Washington, D.C. In fact, I've talked in a previous Short Funk associated with having quite a good conversation about ISIS and the US military's arming of ISIS, be it, well, just completely ridiculously, but still the fact that ISIS ended up with a large amount of US hardware. In any case, I've talked previously in a Short Funk associated with some dialogue with one of these individuals. But the same individual also posted I'm not sure whether it's associated with the academic military establishment on the East Coast, but certainly a video that gave an interesting account of the war in Vietnam, again with this narrative that the US actually won, and setting forth in an interesting way with attempts at academic rigor to explain that the reasons that the US lost in Vietnam, the reasons that the Vietnam conflict ended poorly for the South Vietnamese was the responsibility of Democrats here, interesting bedfellows to be thrown in the circumstance, and also the South Vietnamese. That the US as a military organization, as a country, but most importantly the military establishment which still exists itself currently in Washington, they were all without blame. That the blame should be solely put at the feet of the South Vietnamese, and to a lesser extent the Democrats who apparently flubbed up Nixon's war effort, and, this was one of the instrumental causes of the South Vietnamese to fail in Vietnam. Now, coming to this for a Short Funk, I probably should have references. I've given Ann Coulter as a reference. I probably should have the reference associated with the gentleman who did the videos and his relationship. I went back and spent a good 20 minutes trying to find the video through historical sources. The problem is, going back through Facebook, particularly if people post 2 to 3 posts a day, and you've got to go back a year and a half. Always difficult to find. In any case, I can't find the original source associated with the academic talking about it through the military history video that I recall from, I think it was April 2015. It was around that time frame anyway. So I don't have a source for that, unfortunately, Bob Mottram. But this is an idea that is permeating through a variety of different mechanisms in the US. And what I find particularly interesting is that the History Channel, which has never been a bastion of truth and honesty, but the History Channel now has a revisionist history of Vietnam, which they refer to as the History of Vietnam, and it talks at the end very much associated with the US leaving head held high, and what happened following was all the fault of the South Vietnamese. So this is a narrative that you'll discover. Now, Bob said, well, hey, hold it, wait, there are half a dozen movies, and if you're familiar with the Vietnam genre, there are tens of movies that deal with Vietnam in great detail and talk about the emotions associated with defeat and futility and all the emotions that are traditionally, let's say, associated with the Vietnam War. And Bob's question was, well, what happens to these things? And I have no answer to this. I mean, this is why I think this is an interesting, evolving social phenomena, that you have a narrative which is so counter the historical narrative, but slowly and surely it takes more places of prominence. And if you track this thing actively, you get a sense of how history is changed. And this is a very interesting and very powerful thing to observe, that actually the benefit of having a narrative history associated with success in the conflict in Vietnam fuels the current conflicts and fuels the folks in positions of power that are still instrumenting this kind of narrative in order to create current and future conflicts. It's something to watch as a social experiment with, I think, very dire and very curious circumstances. This is definitely one to watch. There's a lot of analysis associated with how the Germans following the Second World War completely rethought their history and completely demilitarized based on that. And this wasn't a rethinking of history associated with creating artificial victories. This was a rethinking of history associated with the fact that militarism was a flawed concept through Germany, through the, well, where do you start? Let's say the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, early 20th century. The only way to have social change that would not create repetitions of the circumstance was to dramatically address the role of militarism in the country's history and also educate young people associated with the follies of militarism. If this was ever enacted in the US, I think it would have immense and very powerful social consequences and eliminate a lot of the current narrative and the vast quantity of spending that goes into this notion that the US is in some way fragile or, requires preemptive military intervention in circumstances that really have very little to do with the general population in the US, and even very little to do with the majority of the financial interests in the US, because my perspective is that the use of resources, as the US does in military conflict currently, completely eradicates the potential for the US to actually sustain for a long period of time, particularly associated with education, but also, well, you could say social infrastructure in general, but also just basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, these kind of things. The amount of spending that the military gets in the US is astonishing. And even if 10% of that, so if we move from 55% of the tax collected to 45%, if we move 10% in this notion of social infrastructure, it would dramatically change a variety of things and probably impact a lot of the aspects of poverty that the US encounters currently. But the powers that be have no interest in this, and I think the military establishment's role associated with the history of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, people need to track this actively. This needs to be something that people are thinking about and watching. Bob, I've not done you justice associated with this question. It's an important one, and one that I will return to periodically. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.